Welcome to another episode of Living Justice, Living Leadership. I'm your host, Lee Fisher, Dean of Cleveland Marshall College of Law at Cleveland State University. You know, I've had the great privilege to live my life at the intersection of the public, private, nonprofit, and academic worlds. As a lawyer, CEO of 2 nonprofit organizations, and as a state legislator, attorney general, and lieutenant governor. And the lessons I've learned come down to just 2 words: justice and leadership. That's why every week we'll talk to people who are walking the walk. Some are lawyers and some are not, but all of them have something in common. They are change makers. They are guardians of justice. They are living justice, and they are living leadership. Welcome to another podcast, Living Justice, Living Leadership. I'm Dean Lee Fisher, and I couldn't be more pleased today to have as my guest Terry Gilbert. Terry is a longtime friend, but much more importantly than that, he is the author of a new book called Trying Times, a lawyer's 50-year struggle fighting for rights in a world of wrong. Now, normally I would give you an extensive bio of Terry Gilbert, but I'm not going to do that today because his book is his bio. And he's going to talk about that book today, so we're going to learn about his life in the courtroom, which has been extraordinary, but also some personal sides of Terry Gilbert as well. Growing up in Ohio, going to Miami University, going to Cleveland Marshall College of Law, being a lawyer at Wounded Knee, getting national attention in many of his cases, not the least of which is the infamous Sam Shepard case. I could go on and on, but I just want you to know if you're doing something right now, stop doing it and listen to this podcast, because Terry Gilbert is one of those icons in civil rights and criminal defense that you want to know and you want to hear about. Terry, welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Lee, for having me on your podcast.
Sure.
I feel like you can't be unbiased about talking about me because we know each other so well, but I appreciate your comments. So I'm glad that people are interested in this book because it was a labor of love. I wasn't sure how it would be received because no one thinks that their life is so unusual and so interesting unless you show it to other people who tell you you have an interesting life. So I had a bit of nervousness about doing this book, because there are many, many progressive people's lawyers, activist lawyers around the country who have done amazing stuff as well, who probably could write books. But I kind of thought that at this point in my life, after I graduated from Marshall in 1973, it's now 2021, that just by the passage of time, I have a lot to say. And I hope that what I have to say will resonate to law students, activists, lawyers, and just everyday people who are interested in what we do.
I think writing a book like this is really an unselfish act, because what you're really doing is you're sharing stories that people can learn from, and not just your victories, but your defeats and your mistakes. And one of the things I love about this book is you're honest. There are some raw moments where you talk about things that you've done that were mistakes and cases that you lost. And it wouldn't be realistic if it were just about your victories. So we'll talk about all that. But I want to begin today on the more personal side of Terry Gilbert. And I want to start with one date in particular. And as soon as I tell you the date, you know what I'm talking about. May 4th, 1970. That's not necessarily where the book starts, but it is a defining moment in your life. So tell us what that date was and why it's a defining moment.
Well, 1970 was a transformative year for many, many young people. It was in the midst of a countercultural revolution where everything was being questioned, particularly government and authority. There was a spirit of renewal and progress and emerging from what could be considered a kind of a stifling period after World War II of conformity and blind obedience to authority. I was emerging at that time as an activist. I had yet to decide what I was going to do in life, I spent a lot of time going to concerts. I actually went to Woodstock. I went to other, countercultural events. Traveled to California. Hung out in San Francisco. But I was a senior at Miami University that spring, and we were already engaged in some protests concerning the Vietnam War, and particularly the invasion of Cambodia. And I was driving back from Cleveland on a Monday after spending a weekend in Cleveland, and heard on the radio about the shootings at Kent State. And I just was completely astounded by that. I couldn't believe that people protesting would be gunned down like that. 4 people were killed, 9 were injured, people that I knew and have known for many years. So that was a big thing for me, because I realized that in America, all the wonderful things that we have learned in civics class and history, that we respect dissent, we respect freedom of speech and the right to gather, was under attack in the most brutal way. And it was at that point that I think my focus was going to be on promoting justice somehow. I already been looking at law schools that spring, and so I went from Miami University, getting into trouble at a protest where I was chased down by a state trooper and wound up climbing a tree to avoid him spraying me with pepper spray.
I didn't know you were that athletic that you could climb a tree. I'm impressed.
Well, I was back then. And when you're running from a cop, you got to be quick.
Right.
And that summer I went to Europe, and then I began law school in the fall of 1970. So it was a very exciting time on many levels, but it was also a sombering time, kind of traumatic, that there is a war going on where over 50,000 young men were killed. Many of them came back in body bags. There was the draft going on, and people were objecting to the draft. And I was trying to find myself within all this chaos.
Now, I think a lot of people would be surprised to know that in college you actually were in the ROTC. Is that right?
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Okay, so...
And tell people what the ROTC is. I know, but a lot of people may not.
So I joined the ROTC, Air Force ROTC, for a couple of reasons. One is that one of my favorite uncles was a war hero and was a pilot in World War II, and flew fighter planes over Italy and Germany, probably over 100 missions. And I really looked up to him. Then my brother actually was an ROTC at Kent, and he went into the service for 4 years as a lieutenant. And given the fact that I really didn't have a family that could, cover college for me, I had to pay for my own tuition. I took that as an opportunity to, cover some of the expenses of college. And I actually enjoyed it in the beginning. I mean, I was able to learn about, armed forces, and I was able to go on a flight on a fighter pilot over the Pensacola coast. But once I started thinking about the war, I realized that this was not for me. and I went through a lot of struggle about dealing with that, and eventually was able to um, seek a conscientious objector status, uh, even after I had graduated from law school. It continued that long.
Ironic.
Uh, so I had a lot of experiences that kind of came together. Some of them don't seem to be consistent, but it kind of gave me a perspective on the world and about what was going on at the time.
Did you always know that you wanted to be a lawyer?
No, no, I was actually, um, even up to my senior year in college, not sure. Um, I thought about doing other things like being a journalist, getting into government, urban planning, that kind of stuff. Uh, but it was, I think, what really uh, got me thinking about law school was watching the Chicago 7 trial. Not actually watching it, but following it,
Right.
which was the premier, challenge to authority by the 60s activists that turned into a circus of some sort. Uh, and I was starstruck by Bill Kunstler, who was turned that courtroom into a class on dissent and challenging uh, conformity and the positions of the government on various issues. And I said to myself, I want to be like him.
Wow.
That's what I want to do. And from then on, there was no turning back.
Well, before we talk more about Bill Kunstler, because he was a pivotal figure in your life, and later on you got to know him and actually work with him, I want to talk a little bit about your time in law school. Now, admittedly, I'm selfish on this because I'm the dean of the law school you went to, Cleveland Marshall College of Law at Cleveland State University. And I think it's fair to say that just as May 4th was a formative moment in your life, so was law school. So tell us about your law school experience.
Well, law school was a foreign concept to me. I had no idea what to expect. I mean, I had just returned from uh, 2 months traveling around Europe with a backpack. Uh, and then I came back home and I realized, hey, I got to go down to the law school and start my career. I hadn't even really given much thought. And what I noticed about the law school was it was another reality from what I was thinking. It was very tightly wound. The courses were, you know, traditional courses in property, contracts, business, of course, criminal law and constitutional law, things like that, but not from the standpoint of a broader focus as to how it relates to what's going on in the world at that time. And many of us were concerned that the courses were not relevant enough for our appetites. We wanted to talk about civil rights. We wanted to talk about poverty law, tenants' rights, equitable treatment of women and minorities. That time, there were only 2 women in our class of over 150 people. Can you imagine
That's
that?
amazing. And by the way, for the listeners who don't know this, for the first time in our history, 3 years ago, there were more women in law school than men, and that's still true today.
And very few minorities. It was a school that had recently emerged from a night school or a 4-year program into a full-time student uh, law school because it had joined not too long before Cleveland State University if you remember, was part of Baldwin Wallace College.
That's right. That's right.
And we were at a building on the corner of St. Clair and Ontario, where the Justice Center is now. And, there was a mix of people who were working during the day or working at night and coming during the day. There was a mixture of people who were working in government jobs or insurance companies and things like that. And then there were people like myself who, were kind of like hippies coming into law school. So there was an interesting mix of talent and backgrounds that were, but there was also a edge to this idea of confronting the administration.
Right.
Because we were used to doing that in undergraduate school. So why not take that kind of attitude of change, of challenging traditional thought and making things more relevant, became an obsession with many of us. We formed study groups. We challenged some of the courses. We were able to get more work study money so that people could work in public interest internships during the summer. We brought in speakers. So it was very exciting. And eventually I don't want to name names, but the dean at the time, saw the handwriting on the wall and said, I don't want to deal with these people. So they changed the administration. We got a young dean, and I believe his name was Christensen.
Yeah, that's right. Craig Christensen.
He wasn't much older than the rest of us.
Mm-hmm.
And he was open to new ideas. And so it was not just going to classes, which even students today understand that. It's the whole experience, meeting people, getting involved in organizations and clubs, and doing internships and working outside of the school and the community. And that's what I did.
I think it's fair to say you probably would have guessed that you'd end up in our law school's Hall of Fame, and that your wife, Robin, and you would actually have a fellowship in your name that we give every year to a student interested in public interest law. Is there a moment in law school when the light went on and you said, I want to do what Bill Kunstler does, and here's how I'm going to do it?
Yeah, it was a continuation, because that year, 1970, was that trial. But there were also other things going on around the country in terms of criminal cases against activists.
Right.
Where they were like monumental battles of free speech. And, there were the Berrigan brothers who were charged with stealing draft records, who went on trial. And these cases were getting a lot of attention. And there was a growing activist lawyer movement, not just independent lawyers, but within legal services, within public defenders' offices, and other nonprofits that were emerging at the time. And I was very lucky in law school to work for the ACLU local chapter when people were being arrested for various protests, and we would provide representation. I was lucky to work at Legal Aid Society with Rick Stege, Lloyd Snyder,
yes,
professor from Marshall, Bob Handelman, and others, where we did affirmative litigation on issues like garnishments, tenants' rights, and things like that. And so I was incredibly lucky to be exposed to all that. And it was all due to the climate that we created and was available in Cleveland to provide law students with those opportunities.
Well, you graduate in 1973, the year that I graduated, by the way, from Oberlin College. Uh, and then you do something that is related to the art behind you. You have some Native American art behind you, and I think I know why. It has something to do with the formative experience you had not long after you graduated law school, something called Wounded Knee. Tell us about that.
Right. So I became very active in, uh, you know, you might say a left-leaning progressive national legal organization called the National Lawyers Guild. And actually, we started a chapter here in Cleveland. And then I went to a convention in 1973 where there were two major events that needed legal support. One was the Attica case, where over 40 inmates who stood up against inhumane treatment at Attica Prison in New York were mowed down through National Guard deployment by Governor Nelson Rockefeller. That was a case that Kunstler was involved as well. I did some research work and went out there actually and did some work. But what really resonated for me was the call for lawyers and law students to go out to South Dakota, because it was right after the Wounded Knee occupation and standoff for 72 days, where over 350 people, most of them Native Americans, were arrested and charged with various offenses. So as soon as I graduated law school, I got into my Plymouth Duster and drove out to South Dakota and wound up in Rapid City, and as part of the Wounded Knee Legal Defense Offense Committee.
People should Google Wounded Knee if they've never heard of it, because it's an important part of American history that you were a part of. So you get back from Wounded Knee and you come back to Cleveland, Ohio. Then what?
So then, I had taken the bar and realized that I had no job to make a living. And I had applied for what was called the Reginald Heber Smith Fellowship, which was a organization that gave out stipends for lawyers who wanted to do community social justice kinds of work. And if you got the fellowship, which at that point was $10,000 a year, you basically go anywhere in the country you wanted to and work for any community group or public interest organization or even government agencies. And I was very excited about that. And except for what happened was Richard Nixon cut the program, eliminated it that year, because he thought that legal services, legal aid type organizations were being radicalized. So he wanted to cut the progressive lawyers out of the legal services. And his answer to that was, we're just going to defund it. And it's been that way ever since, actually. And that's why legal services is always strapped for money, because they're not getting it from the private, they're not getting it from the government entities.
Right.
Hopefully that could change someday. But so I just decided to just practice law and start my own practice.
Do you remember your first case?
And well, I was working with Eugene Bayer, who was an old time, like old communist type of guy. He's, he became a lawyer at age 46. He was in the wholesale cigar tobacco business, smoked a cigar, And he had an office in the Leader Building and gave me an office to work out of, even though I was not being paid for him. I had to earn my own money. He would give me some cases. He would take 2/3 and I'd keep 1/3 of the fee. That's how it worked. And then I would get myself on all the appointment lists, like, common police court, criminal appointments. I'd get referrals from legal aid for divorces. I'd do bankruptcies. I did tenant rights. But the first big case that I had that was representing the Black Unity House, which was a kind of a Black nationalist group, more culturally advancing the history of African Americans, and to promote, to educate people what kind of a culture this really is, as opposed to the narrative that was going on in the media. They also had guns.
Oh,
And they'd march around with their guns. They'd do drills, and they had uniforms. And the FBI raided the Black Unity House over on Hayden Avenue in East Cleveland and took all the guns. And here I am, this lawyer that really had never done much litigation. I sued the FBI. That was my first case.
Wow, that's a gutsy thing to do.
Yeah, because I just didn't think anything bad was going to happen to me. I mean, that's how naive I was. I was just wanted to do the right thing. And believe it or not, I got them to return all the guns.
Very interesting.
Right. So that kind of got me going. And but for the first year or so, I was just trying to pay my rent.
I get it. In other words, you were not yet really a people's lawyer. You were really a struggling lawyer trying to get whatever came in the door. And then you realized that you actually had a talent for standing up to authority and doing something about it and using your legal skills.
I mean, the other thing, I was being connected to actual disadvantaged people. I was interacting and relating to people who had. I mean, I was kind of immune in growing up from the horrors of what goes on in some communities. Protected from that, but I just wanted to be with people. And one task that I had was setting up an office at Carver Park, which still is a public housing project. It was one of the first to be created in the 30s. And my job was to take all the tenants' grievances. No hot water, the electricity wasn't working. They didn't pick up the trash. There was insects and rats and all this stuff. And people would come to me, and I had this little office at the place, and I would try to address their grievances. What was important about all this different kind of legal work, was to get a broad understanding of how the legal system works.
Yes.
And how to navigate it. A lot of people today just focus on one area, and I was very lucky in my younger years to be all over the place in terms of legal work.
Well, you've done both criminal defense and civil rights, and sometimes they intersected at the same time. You talk about lots of pretty famous and life-changing cases in your book, and today I just would like you to focus on a few. What would you say are two of the three most important cases you ever worked on? Let's start with the first one.
Well, I think that it's hard because I'll tell you, I'll get to your question.
Sure.
Writing this book with Carlo, there were so many cases that we had to keep out. Yeah, we didn't have room for. So what we did, we try to get the cases that reflect the spectrum of work that I did.
Okay.
And so obviously the Wounded Knee cases and the Leonard Peltier case. Leonard Peltier is still in prison for killing 2 FBI agents on the Pine Ridge Reservation. I was one of his trial lawyers. in 1977. That set up my commitment to Native Americans, but not just them, but all groups that have been shut out of the American dream. Moving forward, in terms of high profile cases, we could jump into the 80s and 90s.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of criminal cases, the Hells Angel murder case was important because I met Barry Scheck, Peter Neufeld, who were in the O.J. Simpson case. And that Hells Angel case was the first case which used DNA evidence.
What was the case about? You were representing the Hells Angels.
It was a murder case. They were outside of Sandusky at a mall. There was a war going on between the Outlaws and the Hells Angels, and one of the assignments to pledges of the Hells Angels was to basically off somebody from the other club. And they picked the wrong guy, though. They thought the guy that was an outlaw had a certain vehicle, like a station wagon, and it turned out it was just a guy that worked in a record store at the mall who got into that car. It was a terrible tragedy.
Oh God!
But there was blood all over the getaway car. There was blood all over the vehicle which was owned by the victim. And so there was a robust amount of evidence to look at that, DNA was the logical forensics to build up. But it was at a time when it was in its infantile stage. And the FBI was the FBI's first case on DNA. And what was important about that, I got to try the case with Kunstler. There were three Hells Angels. One of them I represented. One of them, he and Ron Kuby, who's his young assistant, and another defendant. And so I got to actually try a case for a month in Toledo federal court with Bill Kunstler. We lived together. We ate together. We did other things together I won't mention, and hung out with the Hells Angels and their girlfriends at the Econo Lodge across the Maumee River in Toledo. And so that was a great experience. I mean, and it was an important case because it paved the way for DNA to be used, not only in terms of criminal cases by prosecutors, but eventually in terms of revolutionizing cases which were tried and people were convicted who could not be exonerated. And I've done a number of those. And one of the cases in the book that comes on later on, because I'm jumping all over here, was the three guys, Ricky Jackson, Kwame Ajamu, and Wiley Bridgman, who spent over 105 years in prison, part of it in death row, for killing a salesman coming out of a convenience store off of Fairhill. And the case was based on solely the testimony of a 12-year-old kid. He later recanted in 2014, and we were able to, along with the Innocence Project, exonerate these guys.
Through the use of DNA evidence?
Yes. So that's a theme that goes throughout my career, and it was part of the reason I got in the Shepard case.
You just heard an interview with Terry Gilbert, the author of Trying Times. Now, that's a 299-page book, and we only got through about half the book. So you're going to have to stay tuned for part 2 next week of my interview with Terry Gilbert. And we'll hear about some fascinating cases, perhaps the most fascinating of all, the most famous case probably in Cleveland history, the Sam Shepard case. Stay tuned for next week.